This is a talk about reason, power, and values in developmental perspective, and I will turn these considerations toward planning theory toward the end, and I want to begin a little bit with some planning theory. So here's what we're going to talk about. We'll have a quick review of the comprehensive rational planning model. This should be very familiar ground for most of you. Then we'll talk about values development and societal change, stages in development of reason, forms of socio-political power, and then see what all of this means for planning theory in a developmental perspective. So let's get started with a quick review of planning's theoretical foundation, the comprehensive rational plan. I like this graphic because it shows the different stages of the comprehensive rational plan. It has citizen participation right in the middle, informing all steps within the plan. And it is also in the shape of a Moebius curve, so that once you get on it, you never get off. Of course, at the heart of it all is citizen participation, which is designed to inform each step along the way as a way of producing opportunities for a more effective practice in local democracy. This model really has come out of an analysis of personal decision making, and it tends to be pretty good at simple problems. And it tends to work okay with complicated problems that can be broken down into a set of simple problems solved using this technique and then aggregated back up together. But it really doesn't work at all for complex problems, because complex problems have an interesting set of attributes that tend to defeat this approach. And if you hang out with systems thinking and systems analysis long enough, you begin to discover that complex problems really require a different kind of rationality than we've mobilized in the past. It requires a different values perspective, and it requires a different form of socio-political power to be mobilized. So I want to look at these three things and see if they take us anyplace interesting. So let's begin by looking at perspectives on values development and societal change. See if we can't climb out of a kind of cultural revolution, relativism that currently characterizes our context. So let's begin with the individual. Individual values are priorities reflected in our choices and behavior. Values do develop in the individual as higher values are built on lower ones, and as cognitive capacity and skills develop. We mature as our values develop. It's not necessarily a matter of chronological age. So it turns out to be an important relationship between personal moral autonomy and societal development. A morally autonomous person is able and may well challenge social norms. And it is through this process of challenging social norms and sorting out which other ones might well work, and then the diffusion and adoption of the alternatives, that both individuals and societal values co-evolve. Now, if you can identify a values development trajectory, it would give you a yardstick with which to gauge societal development. This is a human values development map. It was developed by Hall and Tona and a team of international researchers. This is a cross-cultural study that through interviews has identified over 125 specific values. Now let's unpack this a little bit. I like to look at the Hall-Tona value phases because they give you a very quick way of understanding what these guys are talking about. And you see there are four phases: surviving, belonging, self-initiating, and interdependent phases. The pre-conventional phase of surviving conjures up a world that is a mystery over which I have no control. This is a very early phase. The conventional phase, the phase that seems to be predominant in society today, has to do with belonging, and it is a world with problem. It is a the world is a problem with which I must cope. With which I must cope. It is a problematized world. Emerging presently is a post-conventional phase where the world is a creative project in which I want to participate. It seems to me that that's a very different idea and a rather large step to make. And often the horizon, something few of us have much grasp on, is a phase that is characterized by global morality and interdependence, a world that is again a mystery, but one for which we care on a global scale. Now I've tried to characterize the human values map as a cascade of categories, and you can see that there are value clusters that are foundational, focus, and vision that feed into the value phases we just mentioned, that then feed into a number of value goals such as safety, security, family, institution, vocation, new order, wisdom, and luminescence, and are themselves characterized by modes of relationship, particularly relationships between leaders and followers, the authoritarian mode, paternalist mode, manager, facilitator, collaborator, servant, and visionary. With that, I want to move on to some perspectives about reason and see if we can look at the stages in the development of the human capacity for reason. These next several slides come out of a book by R.J. Robinson called The History of Human Reason, in which he regards reason not as something static, but rather as self-organizing, increasingly complex, with emergent properties, which I think is a very interesting place to begin. And it gives us a capacity to think about reason as something that develops with our species. He begins with intuitive reason, a kind of reason that grasps objects but not abstract relationships. It's very weak on judgment. Talks then about concrete reason that does grasp independent relationships, formal reason that grasps integrative structures of seemingly independent relationships, and then a curious thing called dialectical reasoning that holds two tendencies in tension. One, a tendency toward totalization, where there is little left, which does not make much sense, and a tendency toward presencing, which is a recovery of value, meaning, and significance. Now let's march through each of these in turn and see if we can get some grip on what is meant by that. I put reason here in quotation marks because this isn't quite that. Intuitive reason sees only the surface of things. It may engage in some abstractions, but it is bereft of knowledge of its own abstractions. It lacks the capacity for reflexivity. It doesn't particularly know itself. It is unaware of basic laws of physics, biology, chemistry, and therefore it has a limited capacity to grasp and formulate means, ends, relationships. It's not entirely clear what it does is linked to any particular result. It can describe but not explain its actions. It is not yet reason, it is only the potential for reason. This is the infant becoming a child. It's the Paleolithic becoming Neolithic. Concrete reason operates in terms of categories. It's successful at differentiation. It establishes relationships among categories, near versus far, bigger versus smaller, better versus worst. That is to say, it stratifies. It differentiates, it stratifies. And upon this process of differentiation and stratification, it sets up criteria to define, organize, and judge. It transforms intelligence into rationality and exhibits the capacity to rationalize actions. It's the rationality of pre-industrial agriculture and urbanization. It's a good form of reasoning. However, it's a kind of reasoning that is unable to extract itself from its operant conditions. And thus we can identify a long period of pre-industrial history where cities and agriculture saw relatively little change. Formal reasoning grasps integrative structures of relationships, relationships among relationships that are independent of their local conditions. This is a hard concept to grasp, so let me give you an example. Within the domain of education, it's easy to see important relationships between teachers, students, and pedagogical materials. And within the economy, it's easy to see important relationships between labor, resources, and tools. But formal reasoning is capable of understanding the relationship between education and the economy. It's this next level. This is the kind of reasoning that is embedded in science and bureaucracy. It's the rationality of the Industrial Revolution. However, it has some curious properties. First, it's self-reproducing, thus the rapid diffusion of Western pop culture and the extensive globalization of local economies. But it also has strong propensities for unintended consequences. It produces crises, great instability, oftentimes phase shifts. Moreover, it's got a strong tendency to reduce everything to mere formalities. The word commodification comes to mind, if any of you are familiar with that. It tends to reduce everything to a commodity that is exchangeable at a price on a marketplace. And in so doing, it reduces relationships of their intelligibility and meaning. The dilemmas presented by formal reasoning prompts Robinson then to talk about dialectical reason. And I'm not sure that he does so with great clarity, because this, in a way, is the form of reasoning that's right on the horizon. But we'll march through it and see if it takes us anywhere. He says, on the one hand, that the repeated formalizations of formal reasoning inclines toward a unified totality of structures that includes everything from individual mental capacities to global social and economic structures. And this totalizing process, this sense that we exist in an immutable Borg-like form, prompts yet another process. It sort of distills out of itself another process, which we can call presencing, which is a process that seeks to recover value and significance. It begins with transforming perception, suspending intention, and seeing more holistically one's place in a larger community and a larger ecology. It continues on with a transformation of individual personal priorities onto a sharing in the creation of value, meaning, and significance. The Society for Organizational Learning is one outfit that has looked into this in an interesting way, but he and Otto Scharmer have been working with this thing they call Theory U, which is about human purpose in the field of the future. It begins with a transformation of perception, a form of suspending the way we traditionally see things and trying to look at how it is that we in fact do see. Redirecting the perspective that we bring on things from a self-oriented perspective to a perspective that seeks to see things in a larger, holistic way. With that, I want to move quickly then on to the question of power in developmental perspective. We'll march quickly through informal power, bureaucratic power, network power, and something we're just now beginning to understand, communicative power. Power is oftentimes a mysterious thing. It's really simply the ability to act in concert. Power is never the property of an individual. It belongs to the group and remains in existence only so long as the group keeps together. When we say of somebody that he is in power, we actually refer to his being empowered by a certain number of people to act in their name. A quick review of informal power. This is perhaps the oldest and most influential and most pervasive form of power. It's not formally legitimized. It's based on patterns of reciprocation. these patterns need not be bilateral. They're often characterized by domination and subordination. Status is very influential on informal power, and informal power influential on status. They seem to co-evolve. Informal power is often exercised in secret. It need not be public. It is grounded in a command of language, the capacity to frame issues, to shape the interpretation of information, to set agendas, to shape preferences in society, and to influence the direction of cultural evolution, oftentimes through the deployment of media capacity. This is a kind of power that merges with concrete reason. Bureaucratic power is relatively new. I think you see we're speaking in broad, sweeping timescapes. It's the kind of power that pretty much arose with the consolidation of the nation state. It's formally legitimized and rule-bound. It requires a form of legislative or assembly authority. It requires the promulgation of rules and procedures, and it oftentimes seeks to maintain an administrative court to provide opportunities for the review of administrative decisions. It is legalistic and non-personal. It is consistent with precedents. If administrative discretion is exercised, it needs to be rationalized. Documentation should be public. This is a form of power that merges with formal reason. Network power is the kind of power that is often used to energize social movements. It constitutes a social coordination among network actors who usually assume a certain communication protocol. You'll find that they talk to one another in a certain way, and they use their speech and communication to affirm certain values, and these are all understood. Network power increases with the number of members in the network, with the monetary capacity of those members, with their socioeconomic standing, with their ability to mobilize and use knowledge. Network power affects its coordination by way of information exchange, and it seeks to consolidate a specific single narrative. It typically privileges one narrative among many, and in the process it suppresses alternative narratives. We can see this if we look at organizations like the Sierra Club or the United States Chamber of Commerce, groups which have strong narratives, and they each seek to suppress the articulation of the other's narrative. This is a form of power that seeks to shape formal reason. Now, an understanding of communicative power is something that is just now finding its way into planning, and I teach from a book that speaks about this kind of power, and it's very interesting. It's a form of coordination. It's a form of generating a concerted action among people that arises out of deliberative discernment in the public domain. Now, deliberative discernment is a very delicate process, and it requires a certain quality of communication. And it's a kind of communication that typically takes place in groups of limited size. And that communication has to be honest, sincere, coherent, truthful, and non-strategic, which means people have to be willing to let go of their strategic positions. Now, such a group, if it follows this pattern of communication, can oftentimes come to understand much more deeply the interests and perspectives of the other members of the group, as well as develop a deeper comprehension of the system that they are trying to influence. And if that works, such groups can promulgate binding agreements And these agreements are very powerful because they create a way of legitimizing legal authority and constraining bureaucratic power. It's a normative resource, really. A normative resource? Yes, a resource to promulgate norms. And it works counter to the crypto-normative steering of informal power. Now, this is a kind of power that merges with communicative rationality and dialectical reasoning, since it seeks discovery through the interpersonal resolution of complex problems and the coordination of disparate actors. Okay. Now, the last slide. Is any of this relevant to how we view planning? Does it give us some insight into what is the direction in which things might evolve? Well, with respect to values, I think planners need to focus more on mobilizing a concern for the transformation of values and for using that as a measure of community development. Community development isn't simply the number of streets that have sidewalks, curb, and gutter put in them. It also has to do with the quality of relationships that are maintained while these things are being done. It isn't simply about the number of wells that are dug or the number of feeding stations that are put in place. It has to do with doing those things in a certain way which captures the kinds of values transformations that we need to engage in as we move from phase 2 to phase 3. It needs to embrace a deeper concern for reason. It needs to share in the recovery of meaning and significance through transforming perceptions, suspending intention, and seeing holistically the place of the individual in community and ecology. And if you ever attended a community meeting, you'll be terribly impressed with how narrow-minded the commentary is and how difficult coming to any sense of a common ground is. And this is because of the certain kind of reasoning that people deploy when they're in that sort of setting. And we need better to understand an alternative form of reasoning and promulgate that in the work that we do. And finally, with respect to power, we need to organize forums for the deliberative discernment, to resolve complex problems and coordinate competing interests. And we do this with an understanding that communicative power is a normative resource that can lead to a renewed legitimacy to actions in the public domain. Thank you.